Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, In-Depth ASP.NET MVC Tips and Tricks, presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Don Wibier. In this session, see how Don incorporates DevExpress in an existing project. See complex and advanced model binding, different validation mechanisms, callbacks and misunderstandings about them, other ways of exchanging data between client and server, and more. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today, and we will also send the link to the recording in a follow-up email. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Don.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome everybody. Yeah, today's webinar is all about ASP.NET MVC, and I talked with the MVC development team from DevExpress, and yeah, we had this thing like, okay, let's check out our knowledge base again to see which questions keep reoccurring and how we can, yeah, do something about it to make it a bit more understanding, because yeah, we try to make things as easy as possible, but every now and then we see the same questions popping up again. And while we, do make improvements in the whole experience, it sounded like a good idea to go over these items. So I've put together a small agenda, and if we are not running out of time, there will be some time to answer some other questions as well. But one of the first things that I'm going to show you and I'm going to talk about is how to incorporate DevExpress into an existing project. So you just purchased our products, you have this existing application, and you want to start using these really cool controls that we have. There are a couple of things that you should be aware of, or a couple of things that you need to know before you can actually use the controls into an existing project. It's all not that difficult, but I'm going to show you how that works and what you need to think about. I will also talk about complex and advanced model binding. The controls that we have quite some features, and they have quite some really nice functions in them. And obviously the MVC framework comes with models and binding to properties of models. I'll show you how that works as well. Then there are also, for the MVC framework, there are a number of validation frameworks out there. And DevExpress controls also have their own validation mechanism, which is really powerful. But I will talk about the different most popular ones and see how you can actually use the DevExpress controls with all of them. Another thing which is really nice for your end user, if you want to give your end user a really nice experience, then you need to use callbacks. And also our controls themselves use callbacks under the hood. You don't need to do a lot about it. But there are a couple of things that you need to know to properly use those callbacks, and also use your own callbacks to improve the end user experience altogether. And another thing that comes with the callbacks is exchanging data between client and server. Obviously, an MVC or a web application in general is a stateless application. So if you want to exchange data between the client and the server without doing a full reload of your page, you can do that as well in a really nice way. And I'll show you a couple of examples on that as well. And as also Amanda mentioned, if we have some time, I will be able to answer a couple of questions as well. I obviously have some assistance from the development team to answer questions in the chat box as well. So whenever you have something, feel free to ask immediately in the chat box. And let's start with incorporating a DevExpress control set into an existing project. So I have set up a small demo solution. It's got two projects. One of the projects is the one I'm going to start with. And don't worry, I'll post this project on GitHub as well. I'll post a link in the thank you page in the end, so you can actually clone it and play around with it. The first thing I have done is I have created a small application which I've put together with the Visual Studio project template that comes from Microsoft. So there is nothing in here that concerns DevExpress. You will just see, I'll run the application. You will just see the nice Bootstrap default project. And I will show you how you can start using the DevExpress controls in that. So here we have the application, and let's replace a couple of things on the home page with a DevExpress control. Incorporating the DevExpress technology in a project is actually a two-stage phase basically. So we have a couple of things that is being done through wizards that we have. Maybe you don't use the wizards and maybe you want to do it all by yourself. That's also possible. But even if you use the wizard, you probably need to fine-tune a couple of things manually as well. And I'll show you how this works. So the combination with the wizard and the manual integration. Well, I showed you the application, and let's go to the index view here. And let me replace the text which is here with a DevExpress calendar. So the easiest way to start is by activating the context menu in the editor by right-clicking and select the Insert DevExpress MVC Extension. And this is one of the wizards that we provide. And in this case, it's going to be a really simple one. So I will select the calendar control. I will give this a name, in this case calendar. And I will not even use the binding, and I will not bind it to properties of the model because there isn't actually a model in this demo application, but I will just show you how to incorporate the calendar. Well, once I hit the insert button, you will see the editor flash to a couple of different places here. And one of them was the web.config. I'll get back to that a bit later. But the most important thing is the pop-up that you're seeing right now, the information box. The information box shows you a couple of things. The wizard has actually analyzed the application, and it has determined that you need to insert a couple of things before you can run your project with the DevExpress calendar in this case. We will need to include a number of style sheets for the look and feel, and we will need to include a bunch of JavaScripts for the functionality of the controls. And below there is something here about a DevExpress config section. I'll get to that a bit later. Let me first hit the copy button here to copy these lines of code in the upper pane. It also says that insert the following code to your layout view. So let me close this one down. I'll go to the layout view of my site. And it says place it here in the head. Well, typically this should work, but in the current situation, let me show you what's going on, because this will not work entirely the way we want. But fortunately, we also have some stuff available for this as well. If I hit F12 to activate the developer tools, while it is loading the page, well, let me do it again. I will activate the developer tools. I'll open up the console. And what is interesting to mention here, a couple of errors has occurred, or at least messages are being shown in the console. And one of them is the first one actually. jQuery script was attached after the DevExpress scripts. And this is a very important thing to understand. the DevExpress MVC extensions are depending on jQuery. And what we actually do is we extend a number of classes, jQuery classes, with their own functionality to let the controls do what we want them to do. So it is very important to understand that we first need to load the jQuery script before actually rendering out the DevExpress scripts that I just pasted in the head. And because this was not the case, we'll have a number of other errors as well, as you can see. The other errors are not really of any concern if you solve the first step, which was the jQuery one. Fortunately, that is quite easily solved, because if we go to the layout view, what you see here is that the jQuery script is rendered at the bottom of the page, while the DevExpress scripts need to be executed in the head of the page. So we can solve this by putting jQuery in the head as well, right before the scripts. Let me give it some extra space here. So I will just move this up, and with this in place, the control should work properly, and we'll get rid of the error message. So let me do it again. If I save the page and reload the page here, what you'll see is that the console is nice and empty, and in this case the control is again rendered, but it is also fully functional now, because at the previous stage the control was showing, but it is not fully functional because JavaScript errors were occurring. Well, this control looks nice, but we can make it look even prettier because we ship our controls with a whole bunch of themes. This also brings us to the changes that were made to the web.config. So if I would go to the web.config, what you see is that we have added a number of things by using that insert wizard. We inserted quite a bunch of things here, and this is all being done automatically. And the only thing that we can actually specify here is one of our nice themes. So for instance, we could use material compact, and this will be a global setting. So that means that all the controls are now being shown in the material compact theme. And remember, in the pop-up there was another thing, something with resources, and that is something which hasn't been added here. DevExpress can make sure that we link in the correct jQuery files by adding something to the DevExpress section as well, and I'll put it in manually. That was that resources thing here. So if I add the resources and I'll specify third party, and in this case I'm also adding DevExstream, then we'll make sure that those files are linked in your page correctly. You might think DevExstream, but that's something else here. You're absolutely right, but we are using, with the MVC extensions, we are actually using some technology which we developed in DevExstream. So for instance, if you want to use charts later on in your project, we're actually using DevExstream to render those charts. So it might be better to include DevExstream from the start, because if you go further in your project and you're on your way developing this project, then later on something might not work because you didn't include DevExstream. So I would say just include it so you won't get any issues later. And so with all these settings put together, if I now reload the page, you will see that we have a beautiful material design calendar. Let me close this one down. And so this is basically, these are the first steps to include DevExpress MVC extensions into an existing project. There are a couple of other steps that you might need to be aware of, because this control is quite a simple control. But if you talk about, for instance, the data grid that we have, or the card view, or some more complex controls that use their own callback mechanisms, we might need to include something more. And let me also tell you that this is documented really clear in our documentation center, but I'm going to show it to you anyway so we don't encounter any issues later. One of the things that we should add is to be found in the app start folder, and here we have a route config file. And normally with an MVC project, these routes are being excluded, so this is not being rerouted to something else. We use one of the other ones as well, and that should be included as well, which is the ASHX handler. And that is something that that we use as well in certain scenarios for the callback mechanism. So make sure that you have put that ignore route option in there as well. The last thing, which is also necessary, this is also part of the webinar, I'm going to discuss this a bit later, which is about model binding. We have developed, because our controls are very feature rich and they have a lot of properties and they have a lot of features, etc. We cannot use the default model binder that comes with MVC. So we have created our own model binder, which is more advanced, and it actually takes care of some complex properties as well to be transformed into models. When there is a postback or a callback from the MVC view to an MVC endpoint, then the DevExpress model binder will make sure that everything is put into a correct object at runtime. You could actually decorate specific parameters in action methods with an attribute to specify the model binder, but it is more easy to do this, to put this up globally. And this can be done in this case in the global ASICs file. So if we want to specify the DevExpress model binder to be the default one, we can actually put one line in here which will specify that the default model binder will be the DevExpress one. And you'll see in a minute why it is very convenient to have this one up and running. And with this in place, we have actually embedded the DevExpress technology into an existing project. There is one thing that you should be aware of. That is something that you might want to change during the development process of your project. We have only included a number of things here. So in this case, we have included the scripts and the style sheets for navigation and layout. And we have included the style sheets and the scripts for the editors. You can imagine that once you're going to start using a grid view or something else, that there need to be additional scripts in here. Also additional styles. Yeah, so this is something you should be aware of, but we'll give you, we'll mention that once you use the insert wizards, that there needs to be stuff added to your layout file. All right, so a question that we also get every now and then is, okay, so I have this nice page, and in this case I have this calendar which is looking in material, and the rest of the stuff is looking in material as well. But I want to have a control that should be shown in another theme that you have. Is that possible? Well, yeah, that's possible as well. And for that to work, there is only a few things that you need to do. So let me replace this center section with another calendar, and I'm going to show that calendar in another theme. How can we do that? Well, I have obviously prepared this a bit. The most easy way is to include a partial view. So if I would go to my index view, I have already included the partial view here, and the partial view now holds a bit of text like here. But I can now insert another calendar control, and I can specify some extra stuff here. So how would that work? Well, that is actually quite simple. The first thing that we need to do is we need to link in the specific style sheet for that calendar control. And we can do that just in the partial view. by specifying this. And there is one small change here because I have specified a theme option as well. While if you check the layout one, it doesn't have the themes specified or at the style sheet because we specified it in the web.config. But I'm now explicitly specifying a theme. And now it is just a matter of inserting another calendar or editor or whatever, the calendar you'll see when it's using another theme. I can just now include it, and I specify the theme here as well. And remember, I don't need to link in the scripts because that's the same script. It's only another style sheet, right? So that's not really an issue here. Let me see, because this one has a name of calendar. You have to make sure that this name should be another name that should be unique, one of the things that come with the DevExpress controls. And if I would now run the application again, you will see that we have two calendars on the page. If I don't try to execute the partial one, if I just go to the home page, and what you'll now see is that we have one calendar which is running in the material design, and the other one is in this case running in, what did I select? The Mulberry one. You see? So I hope this gives you a bit more information on how this whole theming exercise works as well, and you can actually now mix up themes if you would like to. All right, so this was it concerning the integration in an existing project. Let's talk about complex and advanced model binding. And for that, I have set up a second project in the solution. Let me go back to Visual Studio and close this one down and make sure the other one will be set up as startup project. The model binding project is actually pretty much the same as the other demo, though I have now used the DevExpress project template to create it to make sure that I have everything that I need, and I set up a couple of things slightly different. You can check it out as well. So instead of using models directly, for instance, I have specified some view models which will be used in combination with the controllers and the views. And it's got a bit of a hierarchy in there. Not really exciting stuff, but please feel free to check it out and take a look how I've done this. But for now, for the demo, it's not really of any concern. So let me also close down all the files here and start about the model binding. Well, one of the really cool features that comes with MVC is obviously that you have to work with models. And yeah, one of the controls that I'm going to use for this is the form layout control. And this form layout control, I've put it together here, is actually showing me a form. And you know what? I'm going to run the application so you can actually see what we're talking about. I'll close down the other pages here. And once the site has been booted up, I can go to my contact form. Not that one, but that one. And so this is in essence the form layout, and what you see here is I didn't really do my best to make it all look pretty, but it's looking pretty good anyway. This form is being bound to a model, and once I hit OK, I want to expect a model back with the stuff that has been filled in. So how can we do that with the DevExpress controls? Let me quickly go to a bit of code here. What I have done is I have the contact controller. There is a bit of code in here in comments. I'll talk about it slightly because that has something to do with the different validation mechanisms, but for now it's of no concern. The idea here is that I want to receive a contact view model which will hold everything that I filled in. If I check out the contact view model here, you will see that I have a public property of the type name class, and it's called name. And if I scroll a bit down, you will see that there is a very simple name class property, which will have a first, middle, and last name. And that's also what you saw in the form. How did I set that up? Well, if I go back to the index here, and this is a really nice feature that comes with the layout, the form layout, and it also works with quite a number of other controls. I have specified the model on top of the view, and by doing so I can actually add items to my form by using lambda expressions. So in this case, this item will be bound to the email property that was found in the contact view model. If I would check out the name property, because there was the first, the middle, and the last name, you'll see that I can use a similar lambda expression, and I can just specify m.name and the property of the name. So we're talking about a bit of complex model binding right here. There might also be situations where you are not entirely sure what this property might be, because the beauty of these lambda expressions is that this is all strongly typed, and that means that you pretty much can't make a typing error and find only out at runtime that it doesn't work because you made a typo. And that's the beautiful thing of these lambda expressions. But if you want to do some dynamic stuff at runtime, you might not know that, and you can't use the lambda expression. So we can still access those complex properties by using the item's field name, like this. You see, so I specify again the name.middle name, and then it will find it as well. And you should make sure that the typing is correct, but yeah, that's the difficult thing that might occur once you use these kind of approaches. But this is also possible. Well, how does this work at runtime? Let me run the application by hitting F5 and putting a breakpoint in the action method in the controller. So if I go to the contact controller, and I have already set up this breakpoint here, let me fill something in. So I'll enter my name. I will enter my email address, and I will do another one. And my question. Like this. Okay, so in this case I filled some stuff in, but I could at least also do something like something which doesn't even look like an email address, and then it should be validated. But we'll get to that right after this one, because if I now hit OK, what you'll see, if I would quickly watch the values, if I expand it, what you'll see is that everything that we entered in the form, like the email confirm, the name as well, and the question, is all being populated properly, and that is because of the DevExpress model binder that we specified in the global ASICs file. But also, if I expand the name, you will see that even those sub-properties are being composed or filled correctly. So this is a typical example of advanced model binding with nested objects and sub-properties and so on, and you'll see that the DevExpress model binder is able of putting this all together really nice. So now once we are in the post method, we can actually do something with this, but before we do something with it, we should check if everything is okay. And so this brings us actually to the next bullet point in the agenda, which is the validation of your models. Well, I mentioned it already. There are a couple of validation mechanisms out there which are used quite broad. And the first one that I like to mention here is our built-in validation. The DevExpress MVC extensions, in particularly the editors, they have a very rich validation mechanism in them. And that is not only client-side, but it is also server-side. So you can actually, per property, configure an editor to use the own validation mechanism. And that varies from is required to a regular expression, etc., etc. Now, it's really powerful, but it is DevExpress technology only, basically. One of the other things is that actually comes with MVC is the model validation. And the model validation is actually a server-side validation mechanism. So what happens if you fill in the form, it's being sent back to the server. On the server we do the validation and we'll raise an error if it's not okay, or we continue if it's okay. It doesn't include any client side. But these days we want to have a really nice user experience, and that's also why you use DevExpress, I hope, because we have really good looking controls. So with the client side, we could use jQuery validation. jQuery validation is a framework that comes separately from jQuery, but it's from the same guys. And that's got quite a range of plugins for all kinds of validations, etc., etc. The only thing is that jQuery is client-side, so also this validation mechanism is client-side, and that might not be the safest way, because you can use client-side validation to improve the end-user experience, but you should always check on the server as well in case somebody is tampering around with data. So that is something to be aware of, and the DevExpress controls, they can work with all these validation mechanisms. Probably the nicest and the most used one, and also the recommended one by DevExpress, is using the unobtrusive validation. And the unobtrusive validation is a validation mechanism which is executed client side as well as server side, and it is quite simple implemented and set up. And what you'll see in the next demo is that it will work perfectly with the DevExpress controls as well. And I would absolutely encourage you to go for the unobtrusive validation. I do want to make one note. I would not try to mix the different validation mechanisms in one application, but because that will at a certain stage backfire, because something will be interfering with something else. So make sure that you will use one of those. So the built-in validation, I mean, it works really nice, but it is quite a bit of work. And the reason why it is a bit of work is I'm going to show you a bit of code with that, and then you can decide whether it is worth doing it that way. Let me close down this one, and let me go to the view model. So if you would like to put up some validation on the name, for instance, we need to add some additional code, and I've put that in the contact controller. What you need to do here is you will need to set up a helper class which will return a validation settings object, which is from DevExpress, and here you can set all the internal validation properties that are available here, and this needs to be bound into the view where the editor is being initialized. And then obviously you need to code in the onName validation event. So once the server-side validation has been executed, this code will be executed, and you can actually check all kinds of things here. But next you also need to do the client-side validation in JavaScript. So if you have like a bunch of editors, you can imagine that it's quite a bit of work. And for the jQuery validation, there are several articles out there that describe pretty much how that works, and yeah, you have to decide whether you want to use that. I would like to go to the unobtrusive one, and that also includes the model validation, and I'll show you that that works seamlessly with the DevExpress editors. So if I go back to the contact view model, nothing has been set up for validation. Well, the unobtrusive validation is configured pretty quickly. The way that it works is we can use attributes on top of properties. So if I would say I want this one to be required, I'll put an attribute on here, and you'll see that this will be checked on the client as well on the server. I could also extend this a bit by specifying it needs to be required, but it can't be an empty space, for instance. And I could actually make sure that this is an email address. And so you can set up a bunch of attributes on the property, and it needs to comply to all of them. Well, the email confirm should pretty much be the same value as the email address. So there is one for those as well. Let me also make this one required. And I can now use the compare attributes to say I need to compare it with the email property. And if it's not the same, it will fail. And then obviously I need to have a question as well. So let me put here on this one a required one as well. And I would actually have in this subclass the first name and the last name required as well. So I could actually put up some properties here, some attributes here as well. And yeah, this is basically how you set this up. But what is interesting to mention here that I have set this up in a complex type as well. So this is the only thing I did. If I run the application again, what you'll see is that we can't submit the form because it wasn't validated properly. So if I would now hit the OK button, what you'll see is that the DevExpress editors work perfectly out of the box with the annotation attributes, and yeah, and pretty much everything works. Even remote annotation remote validation works as well. So how would that work? If I would specify some, let me specify something here. What you see is that validation is done on the spot. In this case, it's not empty, but it's also not a valid email address, so it will show that. And so that works without any issues here. Suppose this would be like a registration form, and you want to make sure that the email address entered in this box is unique. You need to do some server-side checking. Well, even that is being supported by the controls of DevExpress. So the way that that works is quite simple as well. There is an attribute. I will paste it in. It is actually in a different namespace, but that doesn't matter too much once you know that. If I insert this remote attribute here, the first parameter is an action method. The second one is a controller. And then you can specify some additional options here. So what's happening once this email box is validated, this action method is being hit on this controller. So if I would go to the controller, I already put this action method in. The only difference is that it should return a JSON result. And because this application doesn't connect to any database, I've done another test. So if I enter my own email address, it won't validate. And then I return a true or a false. So if we want to see how this works, I'm going to hit the run button again. what we'll see in a minute is once I added a couple of things in the contact form, I'll do my own name here. I'll enter my email address here. Well, let me first do it like this. Let me get rid of one. And let me also enter the same one here. Like this. Then what you see is that everything is validated. But once I change it to my own email address, my actual email address, you will immediately see that this is not being validated. And this is the remote validation that I was talking about. It has already hit the endpoint and determined that this is false. Yeah, so even that is being supported by the DevExpress controls without doing any additional properties or configuration on the controls as well. So this is again one of the reasons why I would definitely recommend using the unobtrusive validation. All right, so, and by the way, if you want to know everything about the unobtrusive validation, Mehul and I did a webinar quite some time ago, but you can find it easily on YouTube, where we talked about the whole unobtrusive validation, how this actually works. So that's also why I'm not going too deep into this right now, but how it works and why it's called unobtrusive, etc., etc. So if you're interested, check the webinar out. It's interesting to see how this all works. All right. The next subject I'm going to talk about is callbacks and a couple of misunderstandings about them. We get some questions every now and then. Okay, so why is this not working if I do a callback, and why is it working if I'm not doing a callback? Well, that is obviously tricky to address because it depends on a number of things. But in a nutshell, the most important thing with the DevExpress MVC extensions is that there are certain controls that do callbacks by themselves. And you can actually execute those callbacks in JavaScript as well. And so for example, if you take the data grid, if you want to go to the next page, not the entire web page will reload, but we will do a callback, get the next page of data and render it into the grid. And so those complex controls render themselves again in a specific portion of the page. And for that reason, it is the fact that some of our controls, the more complex controls, require you to put them on a separate partial view. And to give you an example of that, let me open Visual Studio again and go to that particular demo. So I happen to have an invoice grid in my application, and what I have here is an action which renders a grid view partial. And the grid view partial is just a partial view which only contains the grid configuration. And why have we decided this? Well, this is something that we use internally as well if we want to partially update this particular thing. And to show you how this works at runtime, if I go back to the demo and I go to the invoice page here, you'll see the grid. And well, I mentioned that there is a partial being rendered for the grid. Let me see, it was this one. And so if I would now execute this request on the server, what you'll see here is just a fragment of HTML. So it doesn't include any style sheets. It doesn't include any JavaScript whatsoever. It is just this portion of the grid that needs to be updated. And you could actually use a jQuery Ajax call to request this yourself and inject it somewhere in the page. Because once you inject this in a page, the styling will be applied and the scripts will execute. And this is why we use those partial views. For a simple editor, it's not necessary, but for the more complex controls, they work on this particular scenario. So this is not broken. This is just a partial chunk of HTML that will be inserted in your page at runtime. And at runtime, it will look what you just saw. It will just look like this. So this is one of the very important things to understand about our callback mechanism, and that this results in a very efficient way of exchanging data and doing all kinds of nice things in the controls. All right, so one of the other things that is actually a bit in the same direction of the callbacks is obviously exchanging data between the client and the server. And in this case, I'm not talking about a get or a post, but I'm talking about, okay, so you're doing some callbacks in the controls anyway. Can I tag along on those same mechanisms and exchange some additional data? Well, yes, that's absolutely possible, and it's actually also very nice implemented. Yeah, I think it's like the whole MVC way of exchanging that data, and I'm going to show you some examples on that as well. I want you to know how this works and how this actually can be used. Yeah, it can greatly improve your life. The demo that I have is the one that you already saw, and one of the things is the grid. So here we have the data grid, and though the grid has a ton of features concerning filtering, paging, sorting, grouping, we have a filter pop-up, we have the filter columns here. I mean, you can do whatever you want. The grid has a whole bunch of features out of the box already. But there will always be certain situations where the filter functionality in this grid will not do for some reason. And this is also one of the demos that I'm going to show you. What I want is a specific filter box on top here. In this case, it's a pretty minimalistic one. I want to select a date in this calendar, and once I hit filter, the grid should be updated and select everything to that date or on that date. So there are a couple of things we need to do here. We need to trigger the grid to reload itself, but before it will refetch all the items, it should receive that date as well. And so how can we do that? Well, that's what I'm going to show you. It's actually quite simple. There are a couple of different approaches, and I think the most powerful one is by implementing a client-side event on the data grid, and then we can go from there to the server side of things and see how we can get that in. Let me go to the code and show you what I've done. So this page has the date editor here. Very important for my little demo is that I have given it a client instance name, so that's the date filter control. And I've put in this button, and the button has a client-side event. When you click on it, it will tell the grid to perform a callback. So what we can do now is, if I go to the grid view partial, I can actually code that on begin callback and put something in there. The settings, let me start here. The settings, through the settings you have access to the client-side events here, and the begin callback is one of them. And let me close the method as well. There is one interesting thing in this event arguments parameter. So the E has a very interesting property, which is pretty much like a name value list, which is called custom args, custom arguments. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to assign something to this. And the cool thing here is because I do it in this particular way, I'm going to add this filter date key, and I'm going to assign the selected date, and I'm going to transform it into a UTC string. This is absolutely a very important little detail, otherwise this whole trick won't work. You have to put it as a UTC string. And because this is the begin callback, it doesn't matter what kind of callback is going on the grid. If you want to do sorting, grouping, or just do the perform callback when hitting the button, or you want to export, or you want to do, I don't know, whatever, whenever there is a callback, this is being executed. And this is being attached to the custom arguments. If I now go to this invoice controller here, I have this grid view partial, which is being executed whenever there is a callback being done on the grid. This is pretty much dealing with the result of the grid, you see? So what I can do now is if I add an extra parameter here, in this case I will make it nullable. And let me make sure that the name will match. That is also something which is really important. I will copy this over and I'll put it in here. And now I could actually create, modify the view model to do the selection, but I will just run it in a debug session so you can see what's going on here. If I now hit it, this will be, this method will be hit the first time for the initial rendering of the grid. And that's also why we need to make it a nullable parameter. If I go to the invoices, what you'll see is the filter date is null. We didn't select anything. And this is the initial page load. So let me continue. But what I can do now is if I select some date here. So let's do the 30th of April. I hit the filter button. That same method has been called. And what you'll notice here is that that date that I selected is properly transformed into a native C# type. And this is obviously a very powerful feature. I could take this a step further because I could add like a whole bunch of controls and add them to the collection. And yeah, as long as I do it here, maybe I want to have like some other number or some text, I don't know, whatever. I can just say string search text, for instance, and let me break the application. If I go to the grid view partial, I can actually say E custom args, and I'll change that one to search text, search box, just like this. Now the only thing I need to do is obviously if I add this one into the partial, no, in the main thing, where was it again? Here. Let me add this one as well. And this is going to be a text box. And I will change this one. What did I make out of that? Let me see here. It was the search box. Yeah, so once I've set this one up, you will see that it will pretty much do the same. And that is, I will now have two parameters. One of the other things which is interesting to mention is that I should also, that I can also use the route values which are available. So let me quickly go to the invoices here. And yes, obviously it hit the breakpoint already for the first time. If I now select the date here and I add some text here, what you'll see is that those values are all put together. The last thing I'm going to show you about this one is there is another way of getting data across, and that is by using the callback route values. I could also use something like, I'm going to add a property here. And obviously this can come from the model or whatever. If I would now copy this property and put it into the controller here as well, in this case as a string, you will see that this works as well. And yeah, one of the other ways of getting data across. Let me get back to the debugging session here to make sure that it runs. Invoices. Well, in this case everything is null, but if I now select another date here and this one, because I have used this route object, you'll see that this will be passed in as a parameter as well. So these are a couple of very powerful tricks of getting data across from the server to the client and back. And yeah, with this we are well at the end of our time. So yeah, I hope that I've given you a couple of nice ideas and some inside information about how you can use this technology that we provide. Amanda, are there any questions?
Hey, Don. There were several questions, but the team looks like they got to all of them. I don't know if you can see them, if there's anything you'd like to address.
Yeah, to be honest, I didn't really have a lot of time checking out the question box, but well, I'm glad that everything has been answered so far. How can we show the calendar control smaller with the time component? Okay, yeah, that's a pretty nice answer already. Yeah, I think everything has been answered so far.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. Cool.
Like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be made available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. The link, I will post it in the chat box. While you're on our YouTube channel, please subscribe and ring that little notification bell so that you are notified when we release any new content. You will also get a follow-up email with a link to this webinar recording. I also wanted to point out that we have released our launch webinar schedule for 19.1. Very exciting. Those start up on May 13th with What's New in WinForms, May 14th, What's New in ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Core Controls, May 15th, What's New in WPF, May 16th, What's New in Dashboards, Reporting, and Data Analytics, and May 17th, What's New in JavaScript, jQuery, Angular, React, and Vue, and then finally, What's New in CodeRush, also on May 17th. So if you want to check all those out and register, you can do so now at devexpress.com/webinars. All right. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Don. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.